And with that, let's actually stop preludes and start with the most controversial thing there is. So, what's our tax burden like? High, low? I don't know.
Too high.
Well, apparently it's somewhere between 4th and 43rd in the country. So that's useful. Now we know a lot. So this is one that we hear about a lot. Advocates for expanded programmatic spending in a variety of areas will always say we've got a low tax burden. Advocates for fiscal restraint will say we have a high tax burden. And we just decided to throw out every piece of information we'd ever learned about this and start from scratch. And what did we learn? Well, we learned many things. First of all, we thought it was relevant to ask, as a share of personal income, how many of the dollars you earn are you paying in taxes, or per capita, or as a share of the state GDP. So that gives you different answers, as you can see. And the lesson about the difference between those rows is basically, we're a pretty prosperous state. So our rank per capita is higher than our rank as a share of GDP or personal income, because people are wealthy. So we have more income per person and more state GDP per person than you might expect. But what is all this other stuff? Why are there so many rows and columns as opposed to just 3 rows and 1 column? Well, first of all, let's talk about the difference between the 2 rows on the left-hand side and the 2 rows on the right-hand side. We took data from fiscal year 2009. And we did that because in order to create a comparative analysis with all the different states, we needed to go back far enough that the census had really compiled everything. Some of you may be aware of the fact that there was an increase in the personal income and corporate income tax rate that went into effect in 2011. And we wanted to figure out what that would have done. And so we went back and counterfactually or retroactively pretended the tax increase had been in place in 2009 and wrote in what effect it would have had and re-ranked Illinois according to those rankings. The left-hand 2 columns are real 2009 world, and the right-hand 2 columns are what if taxes had already been increased. And so you can see, unsurprisingly, the tax increase bumped us way up. It raised a substantial amount of additional money, and so it moved us, let's say 10-ish or 12-ish points, slots up in the rankings in most of these definitions. So that's the left and the right. Okay, what about the top and the bottom? The top 3 columns are something, rows, they're called rows. The top 3 rows are something called government collections perspective, and the bottom 2 rows are something called resident payment perspective. What does that mean? Well, this was actually really surprising to me that this is as important an issue as it is, but it turns out to make a giant difference. When you go to a different state and pay sales tax, you're still you, and you're still paying tax, but Illinois isn't enjoying the benefit of that tax, some other state is, and vice versa. So the government collections perspective says, what does the government see? What does the government of Illinois and all local governments, just to be clear, this is a sum of state and all local governments, since we thought that distinguishing between those didn't really make a lot of sense. The government collections perspective says, what does Illinois and all of the local governments in it receive in all taxation? And the bottom, the residents perspective, says, what do Illinois residents pay? So subtract out what happens when people come from other states and spend money here. Subtract out, but add in what happens when you travel out of state and pay tax there. And this is not only a question of sales tax associated with traveling, it also has to do with tax on capital gains when people have out-of-state investments and so forth. But what you'll see, if you compare the top to the bottom, if you pick a cell and look at the apples-to-apples comparison, you'll find that our ranking is way higher at the bottom. In other words, we do a really rotten job of exporting our tax burden. And we help other states. We import other states' tax burdens quite effectively. And so this is a persistent quality that is worth talking about, because people often complain to me, gosh, I pay a lot of taxes and I don't get much back. And my response tends to be, well, life is hard and stuff is expensive and we have to realign our expectations. And I believe that life is hard, and I believe that stuff is expensive, and I know that we have to realign our expectations, and yet there is this other element of missed opportunity where we allow other states to export to us their tax burden far more than we ourselves export our own tax burden. The final distinction is the distinction between, on the one hand, the first column and the second, or on the other hand, the third column and the fourth. The left-hand columns, columns 1 and 3, own source revenue, is just basically, and it's not quite so simple ever, but basically, what is every penny that the government gets? And the second and fourth columns are primarily things that you think of as taxes and fees, user fees and actual taxes. And so once again, you find a really persistent difference. Our taxes look much higher than our total own source revenue. In other words, it seems like there's some kind of distinction happening here. And on the next slide, you'll see what that means. We've divided up that total own source column into three slices. The sort of, I'm bad at colors, but I don't know, lime sort of greenish. The big one, the 73% one. If anyone wants to tell me what color that is. Chartreuse. Chartreuse, thank you. Can't imagine why I didn't know that. The chartreuse one is the taxes column, but the other two make up the rest of own source revenue, and they're what's called miscellaneous and current charges. Miscellaneous is a helpful name, of course. It really just refers to other stuff. It's like, you know, rent on state property and interest and various investment accounts and all kinds of just stuff where money comes in. And it's not necessarily a very useful lesson to learn from, because the state isn't going to now build a time machine and have bought up more property 100 years ago that it could be renting out. Current charges is another sort of complex category, and it's things like charges for stuff that happens, things like the cost of school lunch, and when you pay your toll, and when the airline pays the government some kind of license, some fee to use the airstrip in the publicly run airport, things like that. And these, I just want to be like upfront with you about the ambiguity that this whole question brings up in one's mind, which is that on that previous slide we had really different rankings depending on whether you looked at just the taxes or the whole own source revenue. And the question really wants to be, what ought we be asking? And the answer is, I don't know. Right? I mean, school lunches, clearly that's revenue because that goes to the school to help them maintain a government program, but fees paid by the airline to use the hangar and the airport, it's sort of unclear how to count that. And so I think we have to come to grips with the fact that there is some ambiguity, and just acknowledge that our tax burden from certain lenses looks extremely high, from other lenses looks very, very moderate, and it's worth keeping all those lenses in mind and trying to understand them as we go forward.